Video, we're going to continue with the second kind of person-based structure that our book talks about, and that's competency-based plans. So in the previous plans that we've talked about, the job-based plan and the skill-based plan, these were very focused on specific tasks. In the job-based plan, it's within a job, and a skill-based plan, it's based on the skills that you need to do those tasks. Competencies are a little bit different. The book says they take an opposite approach. I would say they take a broader approach. Competencies aren't the same as skills, although they can get confused, and we'll talk a little bit about why later in this video. But what we're really looking at is core competencies that are very broad, and they're not just skills that people have, but they can be traits. Essentially, they're just behaviors that people are showing in the workplace. And we're grouping these behaviors into things that matter for us in the workplace based on our strategy. Competency sets can translate the core competencies that an organization has identified. Those core competencies are the handful of competencies that that leadership has decided are the most important for the strategy that the organization has. And once you have competency sets based on those core competencies, you can come up with competency indicators, which are observable behaviors that show that people have some level of a competency. So theoretically, you can watch someone do their work, and you can describe what level they have of each of the competencies you have. And these can then, because you can do that, these can be used for not just pay, but things like staffing. So figuring out who actually has the competencies that you need to do a specific job or work in a specific department. You can use them for evaluations to determine who's doing a good job, kind of what their performance is, and then how you want to reward them for that performance. Competencies can also be used for identifying potential leaders in an organization for either training and development. So this is where sometimes people get into a leadership track, or you can do it for succession planning as well. Who might be prepared in the future to take on some of the top leadership positions in an organization? So what is a competency? This is kind of confusing even for people like me who research this kind of stuff in management. And part of the problem is that there were these early conceptions of what a competency is, but now it's much more vague and broader than that. So originally, when people were thinking about competencies, and this is something that kind of became big in the 80s and 90s, they were thinking about it as like a skill that you could demonstrate, knowledge that you've accumulated over time, either through like formal education, through your work experience, through some other kind of training. It could be self-concepts, so ways that we think about ourselves, our attitudes, our self-image. It could be traits that we have, so things about our personalities that help us behave in certain ways in different kinds of situations. It could also be our motives, like what makes us or what drives us to do the things that we do. One bad thing with some of these early conceptions, and you can probably see it right here just looking at these definitions, especially self-concepts, traits, and motives, is these are not observable. How do you measure someone's self-concept, a trait, or a motive? And even if you could measure it, which we do actually have ways of measuring these things, at least for research purposes, we give you a psychological inventory, for example, for some of the stuff. That doesn't always tell us how that translates into how you do your job. So now, the emphasis now is on competencies is really looking for business-related descriptions of behaviors that people can do in the workplace. That makes them very broad, but that also makes them at least observable and measurable, which isn't, the early conceptions weren't always easy for that. So what's the purpose of using this competency-based structure? The main appeal is that if you choose these core competencies, and usually leadership does that, then you have linked these core competencies to your organization's strategy. Again, I'll remind you, if you change your strategy, that does mean you have to go back and see if your core competencies still fit. You may have to change those, but at the very least, there's a direct link then between those core competencies and that strategy. It also provides guidelines for behavior and keeps people focused on the competencies and improving their ability to actually implement those competencies in the workplace. They also, because they're broad, and this is why they're used in a lot of organizations now, they're very good for jobs that use a lot of tacit knowledge, or tacit knowledge is the same as tacit work, very complex work or very complex knowledge where there may not be a straightforward way of doing something. Maybe someone's never even done it before. You may need some kind of special knowledge that you would get in a degree program, or some kind of expertise that you would have gotten through experience or certain kinds of certifications to do this kind of work. So this is really, competencies are really, really good, and they're used very often for managerial jobs and also for professional work, like scientists, engineers, accountants. A lot of you will be in these kinds of jobs that will use a competency-based structure. However, justifying pay on inferred competencies, and when they say inferred, they mean you're observing behaviors that should be related to these competencies, but we can never truly measure whether you have that competency or not, can create a lot of risks where you either put too much confidence into someone's competencies. Like for example, if you're choosing people for leadership, you may choose people that early in their careers look like they have a leadership competency, but if they don't develop them over their careers, they may actually, by the time they would be at the stage in their career where they could take on a top leadership position, they may not actually have that competency to the level you need them to have because it's very vague, but also they may or may not have developed it over time. So it can create a lot of risks for organizations to have these kind of broad concepts of competencies as the thing that they're going to use to not only determine pay, but also things like performance. So how do you do this? Usually your leadership will choose some core competencies, usually a handful. Then from those core competencies, they'll kind of come up with competency sets. So things that go under that core competency. They'll have behavioral descriptors that describe behaviors that are part of each of those competencies in that competency set. And then that creates your structure. So there are kind of three schemes that we can use for classifying the kinds of competencies that organizations can use. One is a personal characteristic, and I've given you the examples that were in the books. I think they're very good. So these are things that are more like part of someone's personality, but also can be seen in some of the behaviors they do. So things like integrity, maturity of judgment, flexibility, respect. They're actually kind of things that are inherent to a person, but we can see them in the way they interact with other people, the way they talk about other people, the way they make decisions, and that sort of thing. The second is visionaries. This is more strategic competencies. These are the kinds of competencies that often are used when we're trying to find leaders or we're trying to evaluate leadership within individuals. So the highest level of these would be things like taking a global perspective. So kind of seeing, how everything kind of is put together and how the system works within your organization, or taking your organization into a new direction. And then the third kind is organization specific. So things that will be very specific to the strategy that your organization has and the workflow that they use. So things like leadership. So what kind of leadership do you want in your organization? A customer orientation, the functional expertise you need to do the work in your organization, and developing others. You can see also with organization specific, a lot of this is about working with others, interacting with others, leading others. And so that's also can be competencies that are really important for a lot of different kinds of people in the organization. Companies, and they'll try to sell you this when you're looking for a job. If they have these core competencies, they'll say they're very unique and they're very different, and this is what gives them a strategic advantage over their competitors in their industry. But what research shows is that most organizations only choose from a list of about 20 core competencies. These are such these core competencies are so broad that they're really not that different from each other. And that's why we can make a list of 20 of them. The behavioral descriptors might be different across organizations, but the actual core competencies often aren't. So who's involved in these? As I've mentioned a few times, executive leadership usually chooses the core competencies for their organization based on the strategic intent. The executive leadership does this because they're also the ones who create the strategy for the organization and come up with the objectives for their organization. And so they're also the ones who can identify those core competencies. What this means is because employees aren't involved in this process very much, there's also sometimes a disconnect between the core competencies that are chosen and the way they understand the organization's strategy or objectives. There's also a problem as you go through the process of actually creating a competency-based plan where you can have these core competencies that get created into these competency sets, and then you have these behavioral descriptors. You're getting more and more detailed as you go through the process of developing this plan, and the plan can become too detailed at some point where it loses its simplicity and flexibility. So that's where this is where the competencies at some level have to stay kind of broad and vague so they can be flexible, but you do at least need some kind of descriptors so you can see if people have them and measure them for things like evaluation and pay. Employees are paid for relevant skills or competencies, whether or not they use them. So this is very similar to the skills-based pay in that sense. But what's different is it's hard to certify a competency because it's not necessarily just a skill. It could be a trait or something else. So we have these behavioral descriptors. So consultants, for example, will often tell companies to use 360-degree feedback to get feedback on when people are using those behavioral descriptors in the workplace. 360-degree feedback is different from traditional feedback. So traditionally what happens in evaluations is your supervisor gives you feedback about how you're doing your job. Unfortunately, especially for knowledge workers, your supervisor often isn't actually with you when you're doing your work, or they do a different job, or the work you do is a lot in your head. So it's hard to see what the work is that you're doing. So 360-degree feedback provides more information by asking other people who work with you in different ways from your supervisor about your working style. They can identify some of these behavioral descriptors. So people like coworkers that you might work on teams with, people that you might supervise in your organization, customers you work with, buyers and sellers outside of the organization you may work with. Lots of different people can be giving feedback. However, there's still not an objective certification then for these competencies, which is quite different from the skills-based plans, and that makes them a little riskier or a little iffier when you're making decisions around pay. So the competency-based structure, this what you'll create like a structure that has very few levels and a lot of differential within levels, because you're describing jobs or competent tasks essentially where people don't they're doing new things, they're doing things that are not routine. They might need a lot of expertise to do that thing, and it's very hard then to come up with a pay structure for that. So that's where this competency structure can be really helpful. So you can have people starting out with competencies at a basic level, and through their career, they can move up to some kind of expert level. And that's kind of what this table shows as an example of what that looks like. You have very few levels, and they're very wide, so people can keep working on these competencies within a level for some time. The research says that competencies can have value, especially when we're trying to identify people for potential leadership positions or leadership training, for example, because they can identify people who are typical versus people who are just actually outstanding at some of the competencies that they're doing. But again, it's hard to measure these because we don't have a good way of certifying that you have a competency or not. So you can be truly outstanding in one or a few competencies, but how do we actually, what do we say that is? Because it also makes it then hard for us to figure out if this person's really good at this thing, how do we translate that to help other people be good at that thing too? You also can have competencies that are kind of hierarchical, where some are actually delivering greater returns for your organization than others. So you can imagine things like a leadership competency might be able to do that because of the position that people are in who have that competency and can use it. And that some competencies, like working well with others, is much better for people who are working in teams, but may or may not apply to leaders who are working with lots of different people in the organization. And again, just like skills-based pay, really any person-based pay, is it appropriate to be paying employees for competencies that they may have, but they may or may not be using at the job? So that's essentially what you're asking when you have person-based pay. Is it okay to pay people for the flexibility they could help your organization have by having competencies that they could use in the future, but may not be using right now?